Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to an entirely new type of video that I'm inventing here. This is a Spec Spotlight for the Spec Shatter Priest, and the goal for this video is to help explain to you what a Shatter Priest does in a Mythic Plus environment. So this is aimed towards people who maybe don't play very often with Shadow Priest or are thinking about playing with a Shadow Priest and want to know what kind of things they can expect from having a Shadow Priest in their group. Or for people who are thinking about maybe rolling up an alt and want to do Mythic Plus on it, and want to know what it would be like to play a Shadow Priest in Mythic Plus, what kind of things you would bring to the table. So that's the goal of this video. That's a new one that I'm trying to make. Let me know what you think. Anyways, let's get started. Here's another new thing I've invented. It's called a damage profile. I was trying to come up with a way to explain exactly how specs do damage, and I came up with these four categories, these four ways to describe their damage, these four spectra. On which you could put a spec. So the first one is whether their damage is really more focused on single target, or on a medium number of targets, or in big AoE. Shadow Priests, their kind of strength is just damage in general. That's one of the things they're best at overall, is just high damage. And they can do damage to many different numbers of targets, but they really thrive in the kind of mid-range of a few targets to hit. They also do good single target in Mythic Plus, but mainly it's in that cleave that they really start to shine above a lot of other specs in Mythic Plus. Now, some specs are able to do pretty high burst damage, but Shadow Priest, most of the kit is not really well suited to this. Their damage is much more sustained than bursty. But a good thing about their damage is that it's not very reliant on cooldowns. They can pretty much go into packs without needing, they're not like Fire Mages where they need combustion to do good damage in a pack or anything. They have Shadow Fiend, which is a pretty minor offensive cooldown. And they do have bonuses in packs, like sometimes their damage will be higher than others, but it's usually not based on having their cooldowns up. It's much more often based on the cadence of the pulls and having their, traits and stuff line up well as the pull goes on. Their damage is very rampy as compared to being on demand, which means that they're not able to immediately do damage at the start of a pull to a pack. They usually need some time to do some setup globals, to cast some dots. A Shadow Priest is a spec that puts dots on a bunch of different targets and then starts doing damage to them. So that makes their damage a lot more rampy than on demand. And you know how when you start a pull in Mythic Plus and some specs jump up to 300k DPS or whatever, Shadow Priest is not one of those. Shadow Priest is a spec that ramps up and then at the end of the pull they're doing good damage. All things considered, this is a fairly good damage profile, especially as you get into higher keys. In lower keys, there's sometimes a problem, especially with the standard Shadow Priest build, where you may just run out of, the pull may end before you start doing really good damage. And if you're in a less coordinated group, you may end up not really being able to leverage much of your kit throughout the dungeon for high damage with the normal build. But there are some ways to play around that. The spec does work in lower keys, but it's got some things that particularly make it good in a coordinated group in a high key. All right, let's talk about Shadow Priest utility. Now, Shadow Priest utility, I'd say, is a weakness of the spec overall compared to some of the other specs. They don't have a lot of ways to interact with a pull. They don't have a lot of buttons they can press to stop mobs from doing things. They do have some, though. So their interrupt is called Silence. It's on a 45-second cooldown by default. And they can reduce that to 30 seconds with a talent, but that's mutually exclusive with taking a single target stun on their talent tree. So either way, that's a pretty small amount of interaction that they have with a pull compared to, a lot of the melee specs that have a bunch of ways that they can stop a mob from doing something if they want to. Shadow Priests do, however, bring Mass Dispel, which is an extremely useful ability in a couple different dungeons. Dungeons like King's Rest in particular, there's these minions that you want to Mass Dispel and remove their, effect from so that they all just die immediately. It's much more often that Mass Dispel is used offensively in Mythic Plus rather than defensively. So it's usually used to remove things from enemies rather than help your allies. Although, in some dungeons, if things go wrong, it might be useful to have a defensive Mass Dispel as well. Places like Ataldazar, if a bunch of wildfires start going off, which is more likely to happen because you don't have a short cooldown on your kick, then you can use Mass Dispel to remove the dots from your group, that kind of thing. Shadow Priest also brings a couple other dispels. So they have a Disease Dispel for friendlies, which can be useful in a couple different dungeons. There are ones like Underrot, where the Lashers put out a stun disease on people. And actually, Underrot has a bunch of different diseases in it. Waycrest Manor as well. Those sorts of places are a good place to have a Disease Dispel, and Shadow Priest does bring that. And they bring an offensive single target purge, which can be really good. It's a spammable purge, so they can use it in places like Waycrest Manor to take all of the stacks of Soul Fetish off something if necessary. One particularly nice piece of utility, especially on Grievous weeks, is Vampiric Embrace. This is a button they can press that will then cause their damaging abilities to start to heal their buddies. And this can be really, really good at clearing Grievous or in high damage boss encounters, things like the third boss of Temple. Really good place to have access to a Vampiric Embrace. So that's a nice piece of utility that Shadow Priests do bring, and it scales really nicely down to the smaller group sizes, so it's much more effective in a 5-person group than, say, in a raid where there's 20 people, and it's a lot less effective there. Shadow Priests also bring Life Grip. Life Grip is, situationally very powerful, but often is difficult to actually find good use for in a dungeon. It's good, especially if you're synced up with your tank and you can Life Grip them when they need to start kiting. That can be something, especially on weeks like Necrotic Week, it's good to have access to. And there are some random mechanics in dungeons where having a Life Grip is a nice thing to do. There are some weird skips as well that are possible in some dungeons, where your Shadow Priest might invis pot through and then they can grip somebody through who doesn't have stealth or whatever, and they don't have to use an invis pot. It comes up rarely, but it does come up. Life Grip is a useful thing in spots like that, so keep that in mind. And especially, if you're a tank and you're fumbling for a way for your group to help you, Life Grip might be that way if you have a Shadow Priest in your group. It's also worth noting that Shadow Priests bring Fort Buff. It's only slightly better than the War Scroll of Fortitude, but it is a little bit better, and you don't have to use, your hard-earned gold buying War Scrolls when you have a Shadow Priest in your group, so that is a nice little bonus. Shadow Priest also has 2 pieces of what I'd call niche CC. So there's Mind Control, which is, it turns an enemy mob friendly, and then you control them, and you can use their stuff. So there are a couple of weird places where you might be able to use this to actually cast a specific ability on an enemy mob. Not too often that this comes up in Battle for Azeroth dungeons, but, sometimes there's weird stuff. The main use for Mind Control, actually, is against bolstering. If you Mind Control an enemy, say you're doing, a Sky Screamer and 5 Sword pull or whatever, if you Mind Control the Sky Screamer right before the 5 Swords die, it's not going to get bolstering stacks because it's going to be on your team when the small mobs die. So that's a really useful thing you can do with Mind Control if you're, really know what you're doing. One problem with Mind Control is, while you're casting it, you don't control, the Shadow Priest doesn't control themselves, and they're just sitting there vulnerable, so that is, bad things can happen while that's going on, but in the right circumstances, it's a very powerful thing against bolstering in particular. They also have Shackle Undead, which only affects undead, so it only comes up in King's Rest and Ataldazar, where there are some notable undead mobs, but in those places it is a hard CC, and that's useful. Otherwise, that is absent from the Shadow Priest kit. Shadow Priests also bring an AoE Fear in Psychic Scream. This is a useful ability to stop mobs from doing stuff, especially uninterruptible things. There's Whirling Slams from those Iron Hall apprentices in Shrine of the Storm. The Shadow Priest can run in an AoE Fear. They can call, all right, I'll get the next slam, and they run in an AoE Fear it. That kind of thing can come up. It can be useful, and it is otherwise a hole in their kit. Again, we were talking earlier about how they don't have very many ways to interact with mobs in a pull. AoE Fear is one of those ways. Outside of all this utility that's kind of listed here, they do have some off-healing that they can bring as well, and they have a reasonable defensive in Dispersion, but they don't have stuff like an immunity, or, a cheat death, those kind of big defensive options for themselves. Let's talk a little bit about the builds of Shadow Priest that you're likely to encounter if you do play with a Shadow Priest in one of your groups. The essences that you're likely to see, almost always, is going to be the essence of the Focusing Iris Major, so this is the beam. Remember how we were talking about how the Shadow Priest damage profile is more on a small number of targets, it's not very bursty, and it requires some ramp up? Essence of the Focusing Iris is a big exception to this. Essence of the Focusing Iris is on-demand burst damage for big AoE. So that's a cool thing that you do get access to with this essence. It fills a nice hole in the Shadow Priest kit. So that's one of the main reasons that you'll see a lot of them running the Essence of the Focusing Iris, not to mention that the Minor is quite good for them also, giving them some of that haste. The minors that Shadow Priests usually run are Memory of Lucid Dreams and Blood of the Enemy. Lucid Dreams here is the big one that's very, very good. Blood of the Enemy, quite good. Although if you're playing with, a Shadow Priest that can't be bothered to grind out Blood of the Enemy for a minor, which some do, you might see some random stuff like Purification Protocol in this slot as well. But these are the main ones that most Shadow Priests run in high keys. Now, as far as Azerite builds go, there are really 2 main builds. The first is a Chorus of Insanity build. This is kind of the standard Shadow Priest raid build. One of the reasons that Shadow Priest does pretty good single target damage in Mythic Plus, even though they're not known for single target in raid, is that they basically can just play their raid build in Mythic Plus and do good AoE and single target. So while other specs, have a good single target raid build, they have to sacrifice a lot of that single target in order to get some AoE. Shadow Priest is not like that. Shadow Priest really doesn't have to sacrifice much of their single target to get good AoE. They basically already have it. And so that build, the raid build that they play, the Course of Insanity, is brought to Mythic Plus. Now, what is Course of Insanity? Course of Insanity is a trait that they often stack 3 copies of, and it gives them a crit buff when they come out of their void form, based on how many stacks they had. So that's a big amount of crit, but if you stop chain pulling, they're going to lose all the benefit from their Course of Insanity. So it's vitally important with Shadow Priests that are playing Course of Insanity that you keep in combat and you keep chain pulling as much as humanly possible. And this is the main thing that I'd say people who don't play with Shadow Priests should know about playing with a Shadow Priest, is that they very much want you to keep pulling. They want you to minimize downtime between pulls, and they want to make sure that you only take a few breaks throughout the dungeon if you can avoid it. If you do that, then they get to come into the next pull with a big amount of crit, and with all their stuff still rolling, and that can be really good. Course of Insanity has some nice synergies as well. You know how we were talking about the Focusing Iris Beam Major? That benefits really well from having a bunch of extra crit, which is what they can get with the Course of Insanity. So that lines up nicely there. It's a good combo. However, in some groups, it's just not realistic to keep chain pulling. And sometimes the Shadow Priest will instead run a Searing Dialogue-based build. So they'll drop their Course of Insanity traits, and they won't bother. So if you inspect your Shadow Priest and you see that they don't have Course of Insanity traits, and they instead have stuff like Searing Dialogue, then they don't need you to chain pull it very much at all. They don't mind if you take your time between the pulls. That's usually a build that will be a concession to the group not being willing to chain pull. When you see this Searing Dialogue build, that means that they're probably going to do a little bit worse in the kind of single target range of the dungeon than they would if they were the Course of Insanity build, but they don't rely on the chain pulling quite as much. Okay, let's talk about some synergies and tensions with Shadow Priests. So this is things that go well with Shadow Priest and things that you have to work out that might be not as good of a combo with Shadow Priest. So, synergies. Let's start off with a big one. Just being on the Alliance side, Shadow Priest has a lot of extra utility when they're on the Alliance side. That's because Mass Dispel is much more valuable when you don't have access to Arcane Torrent. So Horde side groups usually have at least one Arcane Torrent and don't need a Mass Dispel as much. But if you're playing an Alliance group, a Mass Dispel is the best way to deal with a lot of different situations in dungeons where there are enemies that have stuff you need to dispel off them. So things like King's Rest, for instance, dispelling those minions of Zool. Alliance much more interested in picking up a Shadow Priest than, say, a Horde group might be to deal with that, because Horde groups already have that covered. Another spec that synergizes nicely with Shadow Priest is a Protection Paladin. You know how we were talking about how Shadow Priests have a hard time just interrupting stuff often in pulls? When you're pulling a mob that just like spam casts Wildfire on your group, or Lava Burst, or, you know, Plague Blast, or Lightning Bolt, one of those abilities that just gets chain cast on your group, having a Prop Paladin involved in this pull will help mitigate the fact that you're going to just have a lot of those, you know, kicks that aren't strictly necessary to kick, but you want to kick as many as possible. Prop Paladins are a good way to just kick a lot of those extra ones, and that fills a hole in your group that may exist when you bring a Shadow Priest. All right, let's talk about some specs that have tension with Shadow Priest. One of them is Assassination Rogues, and to a lesser extent Subtlety Rogues, although people don't play that one very much anymore, unfortunately, so not a super big deal, but mostly Assassination Rogues. Assassination Rogues often are interested in getting a re-stealth between each pull, which means that like they get more damage if they can start each pull out of combat in stealth. But we talked about how Shadow Priests get more damage if they can just never drop combat and keep chain pulling, right? So you can see how there's a little bit of a tension there. And usually if you're playing both of these specs in the same group, you're going to kind of need to figure out which one is maybe going to give up their, you know, maybe the Sin Rogue is going to drop some amount of their Shrouded Suffocation traits so that they can be a little bit less interested in re-stealthing. Or maybe the Shadow Priest will drop some their Course of Insanity traits. Or maybe you'll just, you know, deal with it and say, hey, sometimes we're going to chain pull and it's going to suck to be the Sin Rogue, and sometimes we're not going to chain pull and it's going to suck to be the Shadow Priest. Another tension with Shadow Priest is other long kicks in the group, so things especially like Balanced Druids or, you know, Demonology Warlocks, that sort of stuff where you really lose further kick coverage in the group. In a high key, there's really not much room for more than, say, just the Shadow Priest to have a bad interrupt. So you really need to be careful when you start adding more than just the Shadow Priest in that department. It can sometimes be okay. It depends on the dungeon. It depends on the affixes. It depends on, you know, how tanky your tank is against stuff like Water Blasts in Shrine of the Storm, for instance. But it can really start to be a liability, and it'll start being a problem on, you know, you'll just run into these specific pulls where you're like, we don't have enough kicks for this, you know, what are we going to do? Where Shrine of the Storm is a good example of this, right? The second and fourth boss of Shrine of the Storm can both be very big problems if you especially if you're like expecting to do it with a strategy that has a lot of kicks and then you realize you don't have enough, that can really start to hurt in those places. So be aware of that tension. Thanks for watching my spec spotlight on the Shadow Priest. Let me know what you think of this type of video. Of course, you know, there's a chance that I missed some things about the Shadow Priest in particular, although I tried to research this as much as I could, so hopefully I didn't say anything hugely wrong. I'm going to put some links in the description to places that you can go to watch high-level Shadow Priests do Mythic Plus on Twitch. And also, I have a YouTube channel that I'm going to link in there, Matthew, who does like Shadow Priest guides for Mythic Plus. Absolutely a great place to go. If you were watching this video to learn about Shadow Priest and you're now interested in perhaps playing one, that would be the place that I'd recommend you go to watch some Shadow Priest guide content. Anyways, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications or whatever I'm supposed to tell you to do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.